I'm going to start, as everyone else seems to have, by acknowledging country. I'm coming to you from the south of Sydney, from Dharawal country. But I would also like to acknowledge the Stony Creek Nation, which these are the clans that live around Launceston, which is going to be in part the focus of my talk. Yes, as Kate has just explained to you, I'm not a humanities person, but these last couple of days I feel I've been in the fine company of academic historians and writers. I'm a little daunted, but I think I'm coping. Am I a family historian? Well, I'm not a card-carrying one, but I do know how to research. That's come from, as Kate has mentioned, my long career in academic science. And a lot of that has come across into what I do with family history. I have to do thorough searching, I have to record my sources, I have to resolve contradictions. Also, as I mentioned, I think on a Wednesday presentation, I have to avoid cognitive bias because it's very easy to find what you want to find. I also would like what I'm about to do to reflect some way on the process of constructing a life story. The other thing that I found that you have to read and read about the social, economic and political circumstances of the people that you're investigating. Now that said, what I'm about to give you is not a history of northeast Tasmania, nor is it a history of the Chinese tin miners. They have all been well written about, and I've read as much as I can. But today, this is a story that begins with me. I'm a war baby. Somebody almost accused me the other day of being a boomer, and I had to say, no, I'm not a boomer, I'm a war baby. I was born in 1942, right bang smack in the middle of World War II. And for that reason, my early years were spent in my grandparents' house because when people married in those days, as did my mum and dad, he was away in the RAAF. They didn't have an opportunity to set up a home. So mum was back in a home that she grew up in. And in that home, there were two pictures. Now, one was a cradle mountain, and the other, I'm not going to show you a picture of Cradle Mountain because you all know what it looks like. And besides which, I can't find one that looked like the one that was on my grandparents' wall. It was rather, it was a rather threatening sort of picture. It was all very dark sepia, and it stood in a dark place in the hall, and I would sidle by it. I didn't know what it was at that stage, but there was another picture on the wall, and what I'm about to show you is not that picture, but it's a picture of where it was painted from. And the other picture that I remember so acutely was painted. It was painted by a relative of mine, and it was signed in the bottom, H. Kit. And I was told, well, that was Uncle Harry, wasn't it? And Uncle Harry lived in Tasmania. So my mum had grown up with these pictures. She knew they were pictures of Tasmania. She also knew that her dad was Tasmanian, and so was Uncle Harry, and her grandma lived there, and she had cousins there. What she didn't know was that her grandfather was Chinese. He died long before she was born. She'd never met anyone else in the family. Her name was Audrey Kit, and that's because her grandfather's back to front name, Chin Kit, had been anglicised. So he was usually called Mr. Kit, so in the end he became Mr. Kit. Of course, what she didn't know was that her father was half Chinese. Now, how wouldn't you know that? Well, I'll show you pictures of him in a little while. But he was just her dad. He was very handsome. When you see him, see he's a bit exotic, but not hit you over the head in Eurasia. There were food clues that she had, a meal that was cooked there, one of her father's favourites, and that my grandmother had been taught to cook this. It was called steak and peas. I mean, it was essentially a stir fry. There was also omelette, rice and tomato, which is really eggs and rice. To do the steak and peas, you had to get green ginger, and during the war you couldn't get rice, so you had to get barley. There were also firework crews. When the kids had the bonfire down the back, her father would arrive with the most magnificent fireworks. There was bamboo in the backyard, and there were old Chinese lanterns about. And once upon a time, she'd been taken on a ferry ride by her father a day out just themselves, and they went to Cremorne Point. Went and knocked on the door of a large house, which she thought was a fairy tale castle. And to her surprise, it was open, the door was open, very grand door, was opened by a Chinese lady who made a great fuss of this little, perhaps 5-year-old, dark-haired girl. But my mum reached adulthood, she couldn't put any meaning to any of these. So how did she find out? Well, when she was about to marry, there were sort of tut-tuts and the like, and they said, oh, we'd better tell her. She might have a throwback child. Well, here's me, round eyes, yes, dark hair, or once before it went grey. I've always known. Mum made sure that I knew from when I could first understand that I was part Chinese. But I was often not believed. I remember being in a White Australia debate. High school, 1955. I took the part against White Australia and had my crowning thrust that in fact I came from a non-white Australian. People didn't believe me. Later at University of New South Wales, Chinese colleagues had difficulty believing that I was part Chinese. Anyway, I've got the DNA to prove it. I'm 10%, which is about right for a great-grandfather. Now, I told you my mother didn't know her background. She was told a myth. There's usually, when you get into family history, you learn that, well, there are myths, they have to be checked out, but usually there's some truth in them. Well, I went on a journey to prove or disprove the myth that Mum was told. And as it turned out, let's go here, a family myth. There was very little truth in it. The myth just encapsulated was that her father was born to a couple who had met and married in Tasmania. Yes, he was Chinese, but he was the son of a Chinese merchant who had done great favour for a Tasmanian merchant, and the Tasmanian guy said, in fairy tale style, oh, however can I repay you? And the Chinese merchant said, I'd love my son to have a Western education. Could you arrange that? So the son was sent to Tasmania, was brought up in the home of the Chinese merchant, the Tasmanian merchant, where there was already a daughter. And when those kids grew up, they married, and they were my great-grandparents. Well, it was entirely wrong. There was absolutely no truth in that whatsoever at all. Not even that my grandfather had been born in Tasmania. So now we're going to go to the backstory. And this took me on quite a journey from Sydney to Launceston to Wellborough, and eventually, courtesy of our chairperson, to Taishan. Let me show you here. first bit of my journey was, in fact, to find that those great-grandparents had married in Victoria. And here's the wedding certificate. I won't read every point of that, but it shows that the groom was Chin Kit, who gives his parents' names, born in Canton, China, which is pretty useless information. We have his signature in Chinese, which is wonderful to have, and that the person he'd married was Matilda Jane Miller. Now, who was Matilda Jane Miller? Well, she was obviously my mother's grandma, who was still living in Tasmania, and Mum used to write to her. But how had she come to marry a Chinese guy on the goldfields of Ballarat? Well, you know, all sorts of imagination. Was she a prostitute? Well, that happened a lot. Let's have a look. I then had to find Matilda. Was she Scottish? Miller is a Scottish name. There was info passed down in the family list that she was Scottish. But as I say, how did she come to marry Chin Kit? Well, this is a long story and we could do a whole presentation on it, and indeed I have. But Matilda was orphaned when she was less than 2, and she was brought up by her aunt, who was also Matilda Jane. And Matilda Jane, we can see here in the 1851 census, we have the 2 of them. And I had such difficulty finding these initially, but they are in the household of the Robert Bell. Now, I'll move on, because shortly after that census, we have older Matilda Jane marrying Robert Bell. Okay? And then we have them getting on a ship and coming to Victoria. Do you think I could find that? I had looked for Matilda for literally years, and the shipping, the transcription of the original shipping list was Bent instead of Bell. I didn't know that name at the time. And Matilda was Miller, not Miller. Anyway, they got here on the Lady Peel, 1852, and, well, we know that they went to Ballarat, and we also know that after acquiring some facility with the Chinese language, Robert Bell, who was your original eccentric and dilettante, decided he was going to learn Chinese. And he began to publish the first Chinese newspaper in Australia, the English and Chinese Advertiser. Matilda Jane Senior died. The paper ceased that year. I'm sure she was a big part of it. And we are then left with this very eccentric man, Robert Bell, and young Matilda Jane. There is, thanks to Trove, you can see this on Trove, one of the remaining issues of the English and Chinese Advertiser. It all had to be done with lithograph stone, just an amazing feat. Okay, Robert Bell featured heavily in the Ballarat Star because he started to get into politics. He would write complaining about all sorts of things, you know, agricultural practices, you name it, he wrote about it. Oh, sorry. There we are. And I've tagged him in Trove, Robert Bell. There are also lots of mentions from that time on of Chin Kit. So it becomes clear that they knew each other. Now, I don't know how many of you would have seen SBS's New Gold Mountain, but Chin Kit was actually the head man of the Sayup village in Ballarat, but he is not like the character that was portrayed in that somewhat bodice-tearing depiction of our history, although brilliantly it was done from the point of the Chinese. But the publisher in that was was indeed modelled on Robert Bell, but she became Bell Roberts. I have to move on. That shows Chin Kit as headman of that village, first person to sign that petition. I'm conscious that time is very much moving on. And we are just trying to get to Tasmania. So there's Chin, there's Chin Kit. You saw him on the head page. He was all those things, very much a community leader. He was naturalised in 1860. He had 2 goes at naturalisation. The second one, he forgot to sign the first one. On the first one, he's a Chinese interpreter. The second one, he becomes a Chinese linguist, and he gets completely different signatures on both of those, but in the end, he did sign it. So there's a potted history. He returned to China. He purchased the United States Hotel, Eureka Bank, became bankrupt. The family went to Bendigo. They ran a pub in the Ironbark Park. And then around 1880, they relocate to Launceston because tin mining was just brilliantly getting going. So now we see Chin Kit, the storekeeper, very much still an interpreter. The Chinese carnival needs to get a mention, and 1902, Chin Kit dies. His business associates, Sun Hung At, these are all very well-known names in Chinese history, Chinese Tasmanian history. I'm keeping my eye on the time, Kate, and it's, yeah, I'm going to race through these last slides, okay? Here I've got pictures of these 3 business associates, Henry Tong Sing on the left, James Arcat in the middle, and I'm going to be naughty. Whenever I see this cartoon, I have to think that he really does look like a fat cat. And then we've got Chin Kor on the other side. The Great Chinese Carnival, 3 of those men raised money for the Launceston City and Suburbs Improvement Association. They raised £400 almost for that association. They were rewarded by being made members of the association, and they were given silver medals. I'm sure this was very much a toy for acceptance by the community. As you can see, it was a very eclectic carnival, and it would have been wonderful to have been there. The money was raised, and here we're back to the Cataract Gorge, and along the edge there, this is the path, this is further down, but the money that was raised completed the path up to the first basin. Now, I'm going to skip through this because another well-known Tasmanian is James Changong. His naturalisation certificate got lost, but when I was looking for Chin Kit's naturalisation in the archive, I actually found this. And if we look at point 4, I think it says quite a bit about Chin Kit, because Changong, it had all got mixed up, and he'd been put down as Changlong. Chin Kit says, I've lived and carried on business in Tasmania for over 21 years. I've never heard of any Chinaman named Changlong being in Tasmania, and I verily believe that had a Chinaman of such name been in Tasmania, I must have known or heard of him. Well, this is James Changong and Chin Kit, who were friends. Again, I can't possibly go into this, but what the lady there on the Aileen on the right set up a wonderful website on her family, which I found and nearly fell off my chair when I saw a picture that she put up of her grandfather with a man who was then called Chin Kit. And if you look below at the picture I showed you of Chin Kit, well, it's the same man. And that portrait had been painted from that photo. And later on, we met with the Changons, and there's the two granddaughters, Aileen on the left and my mum on the right. Wilbur, James Changon was very instrumental in getting the Joss House taken from Wilbur, which I've been to. That's what you see today, there on the right. I don't have time for Jim King's obituary, but it's there. I have a wonderful translation. And as for the family, which, well, there's a very, very potted history. They were all very bright. Henry George was involved in the construction of the King's Bridge in Launceston. Greta topped not only Tasmania, but New South Wales and Queensland in civil service exams. Claire Frances died early. Lucy Caroline, she married. There she is, and she died 5 months later. She married. How did she marry this very Anglo guy? Well, he and her brother were in the same cricket team, weren't they? And so that happened, you know, just as happens in so many families. You marry your brother's mate. And here, last of all, this is my grandfather. Now, on the left, sure, little Chinese looking boy. Later on, well, if you know that he's half Chinese, yes, of course you see it. But otherwise, I think he just looks a bit exotic. And there, more pictures, my mum with him, my mum again, and that's a little me right at the bottom right with the curly hair. And my last one, well, I did eventually get to Guangdong and to Taishan, where I know my ancestor comes from. I'm in that picture, and second from the left, you can see actual personal tape. To whom I'm very grateful for introducing me to the south of China.